This is lecture 8A, part 3. Now, in order for the kidneys to function, there has to be adequate pressure in the glomeruli so that there's enough hydrostatic driving force, hydrostatic pressure that acts as a driving force for formation of the filtrate, so that the fluid and solutes in it that can be forced out of the glomerular capillaries into the glomerular capsule. So the rate at which filtrate is formed is called the glomerular filtration rate, and it has to be maintained even if systemic blood pressure is varying up and down, which it does depending upon your activity and posture. So there has to be a mechanism to maintain a pretty steady glomerular filtration rate by controlling the actual pressure within the glomeruli and keeping that constant even if systemic arterial pressure is fluctuating, which, as you know, it does. So even though, and there are a number of mechanisms, and in fact, even though the arterial pressure may fluctuate from 80 to, getting up to 200 even, the glomerular filtration rate is maintained at a fairly steady value, so that the rate of formation is steady because inside the glomerular capsule itself, blood pressure is maintained. I should add that you don't normally have arterial pressure at the high end here, and if there is a situation where it happens to be sustained in this for a long time, over a long period, days, weeks, even months, sometimes it can happen. If that high pressure is maintained, there can be damage to the glomeruli of the kidney. Well, below, so even if your arterial pressure ranges, the pressure feeding into the kidneys is different at different values. The glomeruli themselves have mechanisms to control it. And the reason they do that is so that they can maintain a steady glomerular filtration rate. Most of the mechanisms are autoregulatory within the kidney itself. There's adjustments, and they adjust for a decrease in cardiac output or blood pressure. They can also even respond to blood pressure that's too high, but mostly they respond to make adjustments for decreases in cardiac output and therefore in blood pressure. If, however, your systemic arterial pressure drops too low, then you start getting into renal failure, quickly running into trouble because the kidneys cannot maintain a normal filtration rate. I just wanted to point out here at the start that I made an error here. There's a typo here. This should be arterioles. There's another spot maybe on the next slide, but that should be not arteries but arterioles, the afferent renal arterioles. So in terms of this kind of autoregulatory effect, you have a response in the afferent renal arteries if there's a drop in blood pressure. When the pressure is too low, you get vasodilation of the afferent renal arterioles going into the glomeruli, so that the resistance to flow drops and they can experience more pressure inside. If that does not adequately compensate and glomerular filtration rate is not maintained and the blood pressure keeps dropping, then the juxtaglomerular apparatus produces and releases renin. Renin is a protein hormone. It will act, and we've talked about this before, it'll act on a protein that's in the blood plasma called angiotensinogen. Renin, in fact, has enzymatic activity. So renin has enzymatic activity that will act on its substrate, angiotensinogen. It'll cut or cleave angiotensinogen to form angiotensin 1, which in turn has enzymatic activity. Angiotensin 1 has enzymatic activity on itself. It can cleave or cut itself and convert, not converted, convert. It can convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. And this is not uncommon, this kind of activity, where a molecule, when activated, will have enzyme activity and enabling it to cut or cleave itself. So renin acts on angiotensinogen to activate it to angiotensin 1, and angiotensin 1 acts on itself to form angiotensin 2. Now there are key biological functions allowing angiotensin 2 to maintain homeostatic regulation of blood pressure when there is a drop in blood pressure. Okay, so angiotensin 2 is produced because of renin release when there's a drop in blood pressure. That's the initial stimulus. That and the effects of angiotensin 2 are as follows. It will cause, here it is. So the error was here. That should be arterioles. And also here, this should be arterioles. Okay. Angiotensin 2 has a effect on the efferent renal arterioles emerging, draining the glomeruli. It will cause vasoconstriction of the efferent arterioles. If you have constriction of the drain, the blood vessel that drains blood, allows blood to leave the glomerulus, you are increasing resistance to flow, and therefore pressure will rise in the glomerulus. So this is a mechanism to cause higher pressure in the glomerulus to try and maintain the proper GFR, glomerular filtration rate. It will also cause constriction, vasoconstriction, of the systemic peripheral blood vessels. In that way, reducing the space, the volume for, the amount of blood that's in there, and resulting in a rise in blood pressure. So these are two ways that blood pressure rises in the circulation, one restricted in the glomerulus and the other in general. These are mediated by angiotensin 2. The other thing is that angiotensin 2 will, by the way, this is quite an intense vasoconstriction. The other thing is that angiotensin 2 will cause release of the hormone aldosterone from the adrenal glands, or sitting on top of the kidney, from the outer region of the adrenal glands. It's called the adrenal cortex, actually. Now, aldosterone has an effect of enhancing sodium reabsorption in the kidneys. So in the tubular system, you get increased sodium reabsorption, and because water follows sodium where it moves, then water reabsorption also increases. When you increase sodium and water reabsorption, you're in that way helping to maintain blood pressure and reduce the potential drop via loss of water volume in the urine. The fourth thing it does, the fourth thing that angiotensin 2 does, is that it stimulates thirst. So the person is driven to drink water and therefore raise their volume of their blood plasma, total blood volume, and therefore raise pressure. Four key mechanisms through which angiotensin 2 acts. Okay, so this is a diagram illustrating some of the things that I just talked about, and really is demonstrating how sodium and actually both sodium and potassium levels are balanced and maintained in the blood plasma. So if sodium drops too much, and you should remember that potassium is always acting opposite from sodium. So if sodium drops too much, or actually if potassium rises, it's too high, then what you get is stimulation of the renin-angiotensin mechanism that I just described. And it will act on the adrenal cortex, the part that produces aldosterone, to trigger release of aldosterone. And aldosterone can act in the tubules, the tubular system in the kidneys, to cause increased, as I told you earlier, sodium reabsorption, which of course means also increased reabsorption of water, and it also can increase potassium secretion. So too high a level of potassium will also be able to trigger aldosterone and cause more potassium secretion. The sodium is a question of if there's a drop in sodium level, then you get increased sodium reabsorption. And the main effect is in fact on sodium. So this is the effect of aldosterone. This describes the effect of aldosterone on sodium and potassium. Okay, let's talk about another hormone. We've talked about renin and angiotensin 2 and aldosterone. Let's talk about another hormone that has an effect on the kidneys and blood pressure and maintenance of proper osmolarity. So kidney function, and when we talk about kidney function, in the end we're really talking about how fast or how well glomerular filtration rate is maintained, and what things are being reabsorbed or not, and the degree to which they're reabsorbed or not. So in the end, there's a responsiveness in the kidney to the blood pressure that it's experiencing and the osmolarity, and I'll describe that here. If the blood volume, the overall volume decreases, then blood pressure decreases, because you have a lower volume of blood inside that space of the vasculature, and therefore the blood pressure drops. And that decrease in blood pressure, has an effect and is picked up by the sensory baroreceptors, the pressure receptors in the walls of the aorta, which are the aortic bodies, and in the walls of the carotid arteries in the neck, which are the carotid bodies. So the aortic bodies and the carotid bodies, which contain pressure receptors or stretch receptors, baroreceptors, same thing, can sense that decrease in blood pressure, send signals to the hypothalamus in the brain. It's a gland in the brain that will, well, I should point out to you, the hypothalamus produces several different hormones, one of which is called antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. And that antidiuretic hormone is exported from the hypothalamus to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, which is also in the brain. There should be, here is missing a word, lobe. You should put that in there. All right, so a drop in blood pressure is detected by sensory nerve receptors, sends the signals up into the brain, and signaling the hypothalamus to trigger more release of ADH into the, well, it triggers actually the posterior lobe of the pituitary to release the antidiuretic hormone that is produced in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior lobe of the pituitary. Now, antidiuretic hormone has an effect on the collecting ducts in the kidney. It allows them to be permeable. If antidiuretic hormone is produced, then the collecting ducts become permeable to water. The reason is because ADH will stimulate expression of pores or channels for water called aquaporin. These are water channels in the wall of the collecting duct. If antidiuretic hormone is produced, then you have these aquaporins expressed in the collecting duct, the wall of the collecting duct, and water gets reabsorbed from the fluid inside the space of the filter of the duct system. So it's a question of do you reabsorb more water and in that way help to maintain blood pressure? And that's the effect on one of the effects that you have to try and maintain blood pressure. Let's move on. So if the previous one was with a drop in blood pressure, and here you have an increase in blood volume, so an increase in blood pressure. If the situation is different and there's an increase in blood pressure, that is can also be sensed by the baroreceptors in the aortic bodies and carotid bodies, and that also gets sent to the brain, in this case the cardiovascular center in the brainstem, and it will trigger an output from the brain, a sympathetic nervous system output. Okay, remember the sympathetic nervous system or sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is the one that is the fight or flight response. So it doesn't trigger an increase in output. It doesn't increase the output of it. It causes a drop or a down regulation of sympathetic nervous system output. Okay, so impulses from the sympathetic division are reduced, and in that way, in order to try and drop the blood pressure rise, to bring it back down, and the effect of that output from the central nervous system is that the afferent arterioles will dilate. Yeah, the afferent arterioles will dilate. Because the afferent arterioles dilate, there's an increased pressure inside the glomerulus, and glomerular filtration rate will rise. So with an increasing glomerular filtration rate, you get an increased formation of filtrate, sodium and water output. Now, if you combine that with the fact that with a high blood pressure you don't have ADH release, then a lot of that increased formation of filtrate, volume of filtrate, will in fact go out. It'll be fluid being lost from the kidneys. This phenomena of with a sudden rise in blood pressure, this idea of a drop in the sympathetic nervous system output to the kidneys triggering this kind of increased GFR, is called pressure diuresis, and results in a drop in the blood pressure because of that increased output of sodium and water. All right. Well, the other thing that we have to consider is the effect of osmolarity. What's the response to changes in osmolarity? That osmolarity is also can be regulated or is regulated by antidiuretic hormone. There are osmolarity receptors or called osmoreceptors. They're central, in other words, they're in the central nervous system, they're in the hypothalamus, and they monitor plasma osmolarity. They will stimulate antidiuretic hormone release if osmolarity increases. So if the blood plasma osmolarity, in other words, it's normally 300 milliosmoles. If it rises too high above that, then that will stimulate ADH release from the posterior lobe of the pituitary, and you will get more water being reabsorbed. The term diuresis, okay, refers to the loss of water through the kidneys, diuresis. So antidiuretic hormone inhibits diuresis. You're familiar with this idea probably of diuresis because you're familiar with the idea, I am assuming, that alcohol is a diuretic. It causes you to pee a larger volume of fluid, lose fluid. Alcohol is a diuretic. Caffeine is a diuretic. If we have a rise in osmolarity, antidiuretic hormone is released, causing a drop in less diuresis. Okay, the effect of antidiuretic hormone is a drop in the loss of water, so you have water retention. And also there's an increase in thirst, so a person is driven to drink fluids, and that causes a blood volume rise and drop in the osmolarity. Okay, so here we see an example of what's happening with antidiuretic hormone being present. So you have, with antidiuretic hormone release from the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, you have aquaporins, expression of aquaporins in the collecting ducts, the wall of collecting ducts, and therefore increased reabsorption of water. So the water gets reabsorbed out of the fluid, and the urine that gets formed is more concentrated. In this way, you can get a rise in blood pressure and also a drop in the osmolarity. This is a diagram that shows what happens if there's no antidiuretic hormone present. In this case, what's happening is that there's no increased reabsorption of water that we saw last time. Let's make it a different color. So no increased reabsorption of water into the tissues from the collecting ducts, and therefore what you have is that's not occurring, and so the urine that gets put out is going to be more dilute, and let me see now. Yeah, it'll be more dilute, a larger volume is lost. And this is the kind of thing that happens when a person has too much higher blood pressure, so they'll put out more urine. When a person has too low osmolarity of their blood plasma, if their blood pressure is too high, then what happens is that no ADH is going to be released from the posterior lobe, and more urine is going to go out. So this slide here shows the difference between no ADH when dilute urine is going to be formed, and in the case of ADH being present when concentrated urine is going to be formed. You're going to form concentrated urine if you want to try to retain water, because you want to, the body wants to raise the blood pressure, maintain a good blood pressure, so you reabsorb more H2O. And also if the osmolarity is too high. Okay, so lower blood pressure or too high osmolarity, you'll have ADH present and concentrated urine forming. If the pressure is too high and the osmolarity is too low, then a dilute urine forms. It can be as low as 50. It says 100 here, but it can be as low as 50 milliosmoles. All right, just really, I maybe should have had it positioned earlier. The antidiuretic hormone, as I told you, is in fact synthesized in the brain, in the area of the brain called the hypothalamus, and it gets exported down. So there's the hypothalamus. They're showing some cells in the hypothalamus, and they export down there. I believe these are sort of modified kind of axons. So they export down into the posterior lobe. This area here is the entire organ, is the pituitary. Okay, so all of this is the pituitary gland, all that. But this area is the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And that's where the ADH is stored. Antidiuretic hormone gets stored. And that's where it would be released from if you are in a situation where you need the effects of antidiuretic hormone. You need to retain water. I'm sorry, you need to release water. More water getting released. Okay, there's posterior lobe. So a rise in blood osmolarity can be detected by osmoreceptors and stimulate antidiuretic hormone release. Rise in osmolarity means that you have a higher concentration of solutes. Your osmolarity is rising too high, above 300, and it needs to be diluted, brought back to 300. All right, so that's a situation that will stimulate ADH release, causing more resorption of water. So it has a positive effect here in the hypothalamus, causing increased ADH production and export, and it also has an effect here, triggering increased secretion or release of ADH from the posterior lobe of the pituitary. ADH also, well, I'm not going to talk about this vasoconstriction, but it can do that to raise blood pressure. If the initial stimulus, there's always an initial trigger or stimulus. In this case, we're talking about a rise here. Oh, that's not very good. In this case, we're talking about a rise here in blood pressure, okay, in blood osmolarity. And here, it's the opposite thing, a rise in blood pressure. So with a rise in blood pressure, you want to try and get rid of fluid. You want to decrease the volume of the blood plasma in order to decrease the blood pressure. And so that kind of stimulus will inhibit ADH release. And inhibition of ADH release prevents ADH from being released from the posterior lobe of the pituitary. So this is blocked. An inhibition of ADH release. It's not necessarily the most clear diagram here. If you do have circulating ADH being produced, then it's not exactly the right order of things. But if you do have ADH being released, then it will cause, of course, increased collecting duct permeability to H2O, and the effect is increased resorption of H2O, causing a decreased osmolarity, which was the original stimulus here. It will also, let's see what it shows. Oh, I lost it. It's okay. All right, let's move on to talk about another hormone. So all of these hormones are actually quite important in maintaining, helping maintain blood pressure and helping maintain blood plasma osmolarity by altering the activity in the kidneys by increasing or decreasing volume and increasing or decreasing electrolyte, in other words, osmolarity, electrolyte concentration or solute concentration, changing osmolarity. Now, a key hormone in maintenance of blood pressure and also osmolarity is called atrial natriuretic peptide. And you may see it in some books as being called, instead of ANP, ANF, because some still call it atrial natriuretic protein. There's a spelling error here. Wow. There's a spelling error. There should be an I there. Natriuretic. So ANP, in fact, was discovered by this fellow here, Adolfo de Bolt. He actually was a professor in pathology at Queen's University and had a lab in the basement, apparently, I had heard, and not very good facility. And he was doing work on these unusual granules that seemed to be stored in the atrium of the heart. There seemed to be specialized cells that had these granules, and he observed that, and it was completely curiosity-driven research that he decided to work out what those granules contained and what that substance did. I can tell you from what I heard at that time, the work he was doing, nobody was interested in it. So what in fact it turned out was that those granules were granules of stored atrial natriuretic protein, which he named, and he purified it from thousands of rats' hearts. And in fact, it's a protein that gets released from these specialized cells storing it if the blood pressure becomes too high. So with increasing blood pressure, there's stretching and the ANP is released. And what ANP does is that it inhibits the following. It will inhibit renin release and therefore angiotensin II production, and therefore it will inhibit aldosterone release, and it inhibits antidiuretic hormone release. All of these things will cause the blood pressure to drop. If you inhibit angiotensin II release by inhibiting renin, if you inhibit angiotensin II release, then you don't get the vasoconstriction effect of angiotensin II. You don't get the triggering of aldosterone release, and therefore you don't get the increased reabsorption of sodium and therefore water. And ANP will trigger antidiuretic hormone release, which inhibits aquaporins in the collecting ducts in the kidney and therefore allows more water to be lost and volume lost also. So it has potent diuretic and natriuretic effects. Diuresis, as you know, diuresis causes an increased loss of H2O or water, so an increase in the volume of the urine, and a natriuresis or natriuretic effect is an increased release or loss of sodium. What many of you may not know, some of you may know this, but the symbol Na for sodium stands for, it does stand for sodium, but in fact it's derived from the term natrium. Natrium, N-A-T-R-U-M, natrium is a alternate name and the original name, I believe, for sodium. So a natriuresis or natriuretic protein, natriuretic effect, is increased loss of sodium. This kind of, and that's an increased loss of sodium because of a decrease in sodium resorption. Well, that loss of sodium and loss of water causes essentially a decrease in blood pressure. So this is quite a key discovery. They actually, he left, you know, when they finally figured out in pathology at Queen's University that he was doing quite an important, he had an immensely important discovery and was doing important work, and they tried to keep him, he said, no thanks. All right, let's move on. Okay, so this summarizes that information I just told you about atrial natriuretic peptide, that with an increase in blood pressure, you get increased stretching of the atria in the heart. That triggers atrial natriuretic peptide to be released. And atrial natriuretic peptide will have an inhibitory effect on aldosterone release. So you get a reduction in aldosterone release. This is inhibition. It's not shown very clearly, that, is it? So that's an inhibition. I'm Xing that out. It will also inhibit antidiuretic hormone release from the posterior lobe of the pituitary. And therefore, in that way, when you have less antidiuretic hormone and less aldosterone, you have less water reabsorption, and you have less sodium reabsorption, and the water that would go with sodium would normally get reabsorbed with sodium, and therefore you have an increased loss of fluid, and the end effect here, that's the sodium and water resorption drops, and therefore the end effect is a drop in blood volume and therefore a drop in blood pressure. The other thing that it inhibits, that ANP inhibits, I'm not sure if I had it on the previous slide, but it does inhibit the release of renin from juxtaglomerular cells, from the juxtaglomerular apparatus of the kidney, and therefore it will inhibit renin release. So it inhibits renin release, therefore it inhibits the activation of angiotensin II and the effects of angiotensin II, all the effects of angiotensin II, and which are, after all, normally angiotensin II causes a rise in blood pressure, and so you get this kind of drop in blood pressure. This is all in response to a higher blood pressure, an unnecessarily high blood pressure. Okay? So, in terms of hormone inhibitory effects of ANP, it inhibits renin release, it inhibits antidiuretic hormone release, and it inhibits aldosterone release. And in that way, it will cause increase in the blood pressure, which is exactly what you want, because the initial stimulus was an inappropriate rise in blood pressure. So, yes, I realize it's complicated. Yes, it's a multiple a system being controlled from multiple directions, multiple steps. It's complicated. It's actually, these are the basics. It's even more complicated than you can imagine. And a lot of the renal function is not yet completely understood, but these parts are. Okay, so previously, on the previous slide, what I was covering was a rise in blood pressure. The trigger was an inappropriate rise in blood. Here it's a drop in blood pressure, that the blood pressure is too low. All right. So what does that trigger essentially? You get lower stimulation with declining blood pressure. It's less stimulation of the baroreceptors in the aorta and aortic bodies, the less stimulation of the baroreceptors in the carotid bodies, and so what you have is in response that signal going from this sensory neurons that are baroreceptors, and the signal goes into the central nervous system. It will trigger an increased activity of the sympathetic nervous system, causing vasoconstriction. Increased output will cause vasoconstriction of the systemic arterioles. So you have triggering of vasoconstriction, right? Remember here we're talking about the initial trigger was a drop in blood pressure. So this increased vasoconstriction will cause a rise in blood pressure, right? Which is what we want. The other thing is that the sympathetic nervous system can actually directly stimulate. Let's change that. The sympathetic nervous system can also directly stimulate juxtaglomerular apparatus, triggering renin release. So you get release of renin from the juxtaglomerular cells in the kidneys, and that causes renin will act on angiotensinogen to form angiotensin 1, and then angiotensin. Oh, you know, I made a mistake earlier. Angiotensin 1 does not act on itself. That was wrong. That was wrong. Angiotensin 1. That was an error. I'm sorry. Angiotensin 1 is a substrate acted on by angiotensin converting enzyme, which is in the lungs, ACE. Angiotensin converting enzyme acts on the circulating angiotensin 1 to convert it into angiotensin 2. Now, and as you know, angiotensin 2 will trigger aldosterone release from the adrenal cortex, and that stimulates an increase in sodium reabsorption and therefore water reabsorption from the tubular space, and in that way helps to maintain the blood volume. You get a reduced loss of water, reduced loss of sodium. You have a maintenance of the blood volume, thereby helping with maintenance or increase of blood pressure. Angiotensin 2 also has this vasoconstrictory effect on the blood vessels in the systemic circulation, and therefore causes an increase in blood pressure by constricting all of the blood vessels. I don't know if I've left anything out here. I think the other thing is triggering of that release of angiotensin 2 also has an effect on as you know, has an effect on the posterior lobe of the pituitary, triggering release of antidiuretic hormone. And antidiuretic hormone causes expression of the aquaporins in the ducts of the kidney, and therefore an increase in water reabsorption, which also helps to maintain or increase blood volume, and therefore maintain blood or increase blood pressure. All in response, remember, to an inappropriate drop in blood pressure. Whew. All right. So, yeah, sorry, I did make that error earlier about, I was talking that angiotensin 1 cleaves itself into angiotensin 2. It does not. It is acted on when it enters into the lungs, when that blood enters in the lungs. The angiotensin 1 if there is angiotensin 1 in the plasma, it gets converted by angiotensin converting enzyme into angiotensin 2. Okay. And that, I believe, is the end of this part 3 of lecture 8A.